I'm Linda Gilbert of the What to Pack for Your Last Journey Committee, and welcome to our fourth End of Life Planning Seminar. Today, as usual, we begin with a song for our journey. Please join the Hillside Strummers in singing Side by Side.
A little more lively before I got started, because as you know, you can't listen to that song without shedding a couple of tears. It's so poignant. Thank you, everybody, for having me here today. It really is a privilege to be here. And as was stated, I work with Compassion and Choices, and I'll share a little bit more about what we do as we go. But just to share a little bit more about what I do. I am a multi-state manager with the organization, and so what that means is I travel around to different states that have laws like our Death with Dignity Act here in Oregon, which we'll talk about, and I work on implementing those laws, so trying to bring those into the medical standard of care and help get doctors educated and communities educated about those. So I work in Oregon, but also in California and Vermont and Colorado and Montana, and I travel a lot. My wife really likes it that way because she doesn't have to see too much of me. But every once in a while I get to come and talk to folks like you. And I was here a couple of years ago and was very excited when we got the request to come out to Hillside again, and I jumped on it. So I'd love to go do that again. I think it's such a phenomenal program that you have here in doing this, and the crowd has grown from the size that it was just a few years ago. So what a testament to the work of the committee. To tell you a little bit about Compassion and Choices, we're the nation's oldest and largest nonprofit that works to expand choice and improve care at the end of life. And what that means is that our goal is really that as people approach the end of their life, they receive care and options that allow them to have decisions that allow them to approach that time with the same types of values and qualities with which they live the rest of their life. And out of that, we do a lot of work around making sure that people have the choices that are necessary for them to approach that time in that way. And end-of-life choices is kind of an ambiguous term, and so today my goal is really to define that for you, to let you know about the choices that exist here for us as Oregonians, and to talk a little bit more about what next steps might be available to you for if you're trying to really plan out some of these pieces further. To introduce myself a little bit more, as was stated, I was a music therapist for many years. I worked in long-term acute care hospital. I worked in a geriatric psychiatry and neuropsychiatry wing of a hospital, and then I also worked with hospice. And out of those experiences, I became compelled to really get involved in the advocacy side of end-of-life care, and that's what brought me to Compassion and Choices. And brought me to a role where I speak a lot with folks about these end-of-life choices. So let's talk a little bit about what those are in Oregon. And I should preface this by saying I want this to be a lively discussion for all of us. So if at any point you have a moment where you want some clarification or you have a question, feel free to just raise your hand and we'll jump right into it. And of course we'll leave plenty of time at the end if there aren't questions throughout for us to talk as well. So what are our end-of-life options in Oregon? Well, let's start with what most of us are most familiar with, which is the fact that you have the option to receive all of the treatment that is available to you for whatever disease you may be facing going forward. What does that look like? Well, you know, if you're suffering from cancer, you have the option to absolutely treat that cancer and to move forward with all curative treatments for that disease process. If you're suffering from heart disease, you have the option to move forward with all curative treatment towards that. If you have a life-threatening situation where your heart stops or you stop breathing or whatever it might be, you have the option for all invasive procedures in that time to be hooked up to a ventilator, to have artificial hydration and nutrition. Those are all options that are available to you. But on the flip side of that, to begin with, you also have the option to one, end any type of treatment that you're undergoing. So this is something that some of us, we just kind of get in the routine of going with the flow of whatever's happening and don't think about. But you have the option at any time to discontinue treatment. So for a person who perhaps has had multiple occurrences of cancer and chemo is making them very sick or whatever it might be, you have the option to discontinue that treatment and to talk to your doctor about that. For a person who has found themselves in the situation of having artificial hydration or nutrition or whatever it might be, you have the option to discontinue that as well at any point. So this is a long-standing legal right that we have in the United States that's recognized by hospitals, it's recognized by lawyers for hospitals, it's recognized by the clinical community that you have this option over what happens to your body in your course of care. So you have the option to stop treatment. You also have the option to refuse treatment at any time, to talk with your clinician or with your physician about what it is that this treatment will do or won't do, and to make your own informed decision in that moment. And again, this is just another thing to remind ourselves of, because oftentimes we get in the situation of being in an examination room and getting kind of a flood of different things coming at us, a lot of information, and we don't really take the time to take a deep breath and go, okay, what are all of my options here? And what are the benefits of each of these options, and what are the burdens of each of these options? And what does it all look like? So we all have the right to make our own health care decisions. We also have the right, if we refuse any type of curative treatment, to have palliative care or hospice care. So who here knows what the words palliative care mean? Good, I should have brought some gold stars. But palliative care means symptom management or comfort care rather than curative care. So something we're all really familiar with is when you're sick, you go in, you get medication, and what does it do? It makes you better, right? Or you hope, yeah? But you also have the option, if there isn't an option for a medication that could cure your illness or that could bring you to that point, you have the option to have your symptoms managed. So rather than doing things that are ultimately going to, for example, put you into remission when it comes to cancer, you also have the option to make sure that all of the symptoms that are coming along with that disease are managed and that you're kept comfortable. So that might be things like really great and aggressive pain management. It might be, having some anxiety medication because of symptoms that are coming out because of a disease process. It might mean having something that would help with shortness of breath. Yes, ma'am. Great question. So the question was, is that something you would talk to your physician about and say, I don't want curative care, I want symptom management? And absolutely, that would be the case. Yeah, you would talk to your doctor about that, and at that point they might refer you to a palliative care doctor. So there are doctors whose whole role is really trying to be on the cutting edge of what it looks like to manage these symptoms and to keep people comfortable. And it's not just medication, it's not just doctors that are involved in palliative care. It's also therapists, it's also chaplains. Palliative care is really an all-inclusive umbrella under which kind of fit all of the different modalities that would be helpful in this. So it's a totally multimodal approach. When I was a music therapist working in the hospice, I was considered palliative care because I wasn't going in with the outcome being that I was going to cure anybody, but I was going to make them feel better. And that was the goal of what I was doing. So it involves all of those. Now, palliative care is different and the same as hospice care, because a person could be receiving palliative care when they're not at the end of life. And they could be receiving it alongside curative care. It could be that a person is receiving care for their illness, but they're also receiving really aggressive symptom management to make sure that they're really comfortable during that time. Now, when a person is in the last 6 months of their life, then hospice becomes an option for that person. And hospice is another one of our end-of-life choices that we have here in Oregon. And we have phenomenal hospice here in Oregon, some of the best in the country. Consistently we're ranked at the top of the lists. And what hospice does is it's, again, an interdisciplinary service, a totally wraparound service for people who are in the last 6 months of their life. And not only do they help tend to that person's physical symptoms and make sure that they're well cared for during that time, they also tend to that person's psychological needs and social needs and spiritual needs. And so hospice teams are this kind of beautiful work of coordination between doctors and nurses and aides and social workers and chaplains and the pet therapists and all the different people who are involved and volunteers to make sure that people are able to have the best care possible towards the end of their life, and also to provide options that would give that person the chance to stay in their own home if that's their desire, or have whatever their wishes are honored in that time, and to keep them comfortable during that time. Once a person goes into hospice, that hospice benefit is for them for those 6 months, but also actually for a whole year, because hospice is also there to serve a person's family. So the commitment is that they're going to be with that person until the end of their life, and then they're going to be with that person's family members for all of the grief and bereavement support that they need afterwards. And so I can't say enough good things about hospice and about hospice here in Oregon, and encourage everyone to really work towards talking about it in an open and honest manner, because a misconception that we often have is when you hear that somebody's on hospice, you think, well, I better go see them. It could be any day now that they're going to be gone. And in fact, people often really underutilize the resource that hospice is, with lots of people getting on hospice in their last just few weeks of life and not getting the full range of support that they could have been having for months for themselves and their families. So hospice is an option. Yes, ma'am. The question was, people also graduate from hospice, which is absolutely true. There are many times that there are folks who are enrolled in hospice early in their disease process when it seems like they're in decline. This happens a lot for folks who maybe are early in a disease and they are having trouble with appetite or whatever it might be, and it seems like they're really in decline. And sometimes they get all of those support services around them. They get a little bit of help, and suddenly their health improves. And in that case, they no longer fall within that 6-month window, and they become a hospice graduate. And they continue on living their life, and they have hospice there when they fall back into that 6-month window. Yeah, so that happens from time to time as well. Yeah.
Hold on, we're going to get microphones. Hold on for 1 second.
We're going to give the microphone runners their exercise for the day. I won't.
Hold on, they'll be right there.
Yeah, well, and I think this goes back to the beginning of our conversation about the fact that we all have the right to make our own healthcare decisions and have more power as consumers of healthcare than oftentimes we think. And that's kind of going to be the theme of today's talk, is around those pieces. And so when it comes to hospice, you have the option to interview hospices, to talk through it. It's just like when you came to live at Hillside. You didn't just say, well, Hillside's the community that's over there on a convenient street, I guess I'll just move in, right? You came and you toured and you talked to staff and you had a meal and you met with people that lived here and you figured out that this was a good place to land. But it takes some research and some time. And again, this is why it's such an important thing for people to start this process early with hospice, because then you have time to go through that process. And it's important to acknowledge that you have the power in that relationship. You're the one that's picking. I always love to tell the story of when my grandmother went on hospice. My dad is a pharmacist, my mom is a nurse, and my uncle is a vice president of AT&T. So 3 very tough critics. And they brought in 4 different hospices in one afternoon. They had the social workers and nurses come out, and they sat on the back porch of my grandparents' house, and it was like a panel interview, or like they were playing hot seat with all of these different groups, and they narrowed it down. They said, okay, well, we know which one we want. And subsequently, my grandmother got really good care from that hospice. But again, you have to recognize that you have power in that moment, because oftentimes what will happen is you'll get a hospice order from whatever hospice your physician might be most familiar with or have a relationship with or whatever it might be.
I have just a question. When a family decides on bringing in hospice, how do you know that the start of it is that last 6 months? What's the definition for a family to say, this is the last 6 months for sure, and we now bring in hospice? How do you know that that's the last month by definition?
Great question. So the question was, just to repeat it for all of us, was how do you know that that last 6 months is the time period? How do you know that when it's time to talk about hospice, right? You ask. And this is, again, something that is not oftentimes intuitive to us, to ask these types of questions. And it's also not intuitive for physicians oftentimes to provide these answers unprompted, because it's a very tough thing to negotiate when perhaps a family might be ready to get that kind of news, or to see what type of reaction might come from that type of news. I've heard of physicians that were really trying to be very transparent about these things and had families run out of their office and never come back. Because again, oftentimes we don't maybe want this information. And so letting your physician or your care team know, hey, this is, I would like this information. I'd like to be forthright. This is important to us, and asking those types of questions is really important and can open up the range of kind of transparent conversations. Along that line, we actually on our website have a product that we created called the Trust Card that's free to make on the internet and print out and take with you for these physician appointments, around trying to build better communication and let people know how it is that you like to be communicated with. And so you actually can go on there and answer questions like, how do I like to receive news? Or do I like to have things written down, or would I rather hear you explain it out loud? Or make sure that anything you tell me, you also tell my wife, because she's the one who actually remembers. All of those different things. And so that you can walk into your appointment, if you're like me, when you walk into a physician appointment, sometimes all the things that I had in my mind that I was going to ask or that I was going to say, or just kind of fly out the window. Because I'm in that moment and I'm a little anxious, and the doctor's going, your pulse is a little high, what's going on? Well, you make me a little nervous, I like you. But, and so it's an opportunity to have something that's printed that you can hand to them that says all those different things, and then you open up the line of that direct communication.
I almost forgot what I was going to say. Going back to hospice here, when hospice came to my house to talk to me about my husband, the first thing they said, now if we are not suitable, you don't need to keep us. You can fire us at any time and get another hospice organization here. You're not bound to us. And so I think, anyway, I didn't. They were wonderful. They were really wonderful. So it was a very good experience for both my husband and me.
That's probably a good sign when the hospice opens with that line. Yeah. Well, moving down the line, let's talk about a couple more of our options that exist here in Oregon. And all of these are options that fit within the other pieces as well. So as I go through them, you'll see none of this is kind of an either or a one-stop shop or anything like that. Really, all of these pieces fit together like a really good-looking quilt if things are done correctly. And so the other option that is legal in all states is the option to voluntarily stop eating and drinking, which is that at any time, again, you have the right to your own bodily autonomy. You can decide to stop eating and stop drinking. Now, this is something that oftentimes happens as a natural progression of someone's disease process. So if you've cared for someone at the end of life, you know that oftentimes in their last weeks, days, hours, they lose their thirst, they lose their hunger, their intake slows, and that's their body shutting down. In the same way, there are people who consciously make the decision to stop eating and drinking, and that's 100% legal for that person to do that. If you do engage in that process, we know from experiences that folks have had that after a few days, that person falls into a coma, into a deep sleep, and then a few days later after that, they actually end up passing as a result of dehydration. Something to know is that many of us, relate this to some type of really a painful and agonizing experience. But actually, when a person is at that point, the body is very well suited to this process because, as I said, for many people at their end of life, their body naturally does this. And so, in fact, the body, when it dries out, releases endorphins and neurotransmitters that actually create a natural kind of sedative for a person. And for most of us, when we relate it to someone having a not great dying process, it's because that person has taken small amounts of water or small amounts of food or whatever it might be. But when a person actually fasts and actually ceases to take in hydration, it's a very peaceful process when used alongside hospice and palliative care. So again, this is not something that is done in isolation. It's done with the care of a clinical team who's able to monitor a person. It's not something that someone could do on their own. There need to be caregivers 24 hours a day, especially after a person falls into a coma, to make sure that they're turned and that their sheets are changed and that they're well cared for throughout that process. Hospice would need to be there to make sure that their symptoms are managed, if there's any symptoms that come as a result of this. But again, this is an option that has existed in perpetuity in the United States as an option for people at the end of life.
Janessa?
Dígame en inglés.
If you do not have these instructions in place when you reach that point and you decide that you don't want to eat or drink or those things, then do your caregivers have the right to say, well, you're not competent now, you're not in a situation, you haven't signed anything, so we can't do that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So with all of these different options, it always helps to have it in writing. It always helps to have something legal in place that says that these are your wishes, and to have that coordinated beforehand. So where I've seen this go badly for folks is when it's done in some sort of isolation, and then a caregiving team comes there, and what they encounter is a person who hasn't eaten or hasn't drank or whatever it might be, and their obligation, without any other instructions in hand, is to make sure that that person gets hydration and make sure that that person gets nutrition and all of those different things. So absolutely. So this would need to be something that is well talked about, well documented for a person to make sure that it plays out correctly. And it's something that the hospice is aware of, something that the doctor is aware of, so that they know to honor those wishes as well. And another piece of something to include in those interviews with your hospice before they come on board, to say this is my intention, or this is something that I am thinking about. Yeah. Now the other, go ahead.
This is apparently all free. Now, I'm a strong believer in the statement TANSTAFL, so it can't be free. Who's paying for this?
Yeah, so as in the hospice care and all of those different pieces. So hospice is a Medicare benefit.
Oh, it is?
So if you're on Medicare, hospice is paid through the Medicare benefit. Yeah, so there's a Medicare hospice benefit. Yeah. Otherwise, if you weren't on Medicare, private insurance would pick it up, or it would be something that was paid for out of pocket. Yeah, good question. So in Oregon, we also have another option that exists for control at the end of life, which is our Death with Dignity Act. And I'm going to talk through a bunch of pieces of this process, and I'll probably talk about this more than any of the other pieces today because it tends to be the least talked about thing out there in the community. And so I want to make sure that you have a lot of this information. However, you're not going to remember all of these pieces. So what I need you to remember is grab a brochure on your way out the door, that has our website on it and our information, because we keep all of this information there as well so that you can look it up, because it is a process. So our Death with Dignity Act was passed twice in Oregon by ballot. We were the first state to implement a law like this, and what the law authorizes is medical aid in dying, which is the medical term for what this process is. And medical aid in dying is the process by which a person who has a terminal diagnosis and a prognosis of 6 months or less, so a 6 month or less life expectancy, who is mentally capable, and I'll break down all these different pieces for you, can go to their doctor and request a prescription for life-ending medication, which can be taken to abbreviate a dying process. And in order to go through this, there's a whole slew of different criteria. But just to give you some context, we passed the law here in Oregon, and first in the mid-90s and then in the late 90s. I always like to talk about how Oregon passed the law twice, because the first time it passed by a very small margin, and the second time it passed by a much larger margin, because Oregonians don't like being told that they were wrong. So they really jumped on it the second time. And so we've had it since 1998 when it went into effect here. Washington State followed 10 years later in 2008 and enacted their own Death with Dignity Act. Montana followed with actually a court case there that said that this was authorized in that state. Vermont followed after that. California came along just last June and authorized medical aid in dying. Colorado, this year in November at the election, they passed aid in dying law. And then the District of Columbia, just a few weeks ago, voted to authorize this practice there as well. So we were the pioneers of it, and now it is kind of catching on across the country. So to talk a little bit about this law, as I said, in order to be eligible for this, there's a couple of requirements. One, a person has to be an adult. So in Oregon, you have to be 18 or older in order to access medical aid in dying. You have to be a resident of Oregon. And resident is not defined in the law, but typically for a physician to participate with you, they want to make sure that you have an Oregon address, that you have actually been here for a while, that you're able to establish care with them. And as you'll hear through the process, it would be almost impossible to get through the process if you didn't actually live in the state of Oregon. You have to have a prognosis of 6 months or less, and you have to be mentally capable. And mental capacity is defined as being able to make your own healthcare decisions in this option. And that goes for the moment that you get the medication all the way to the time that you ingest the medication. So I always say it's important to remember who this law is for and who it's not for, so that you understand, I think, how narrow the door is for this. This law would not apply for someone who has advanced Alzheimer's and has lost their capacity to make medical decisions. And that's because the big underpinning of this law was personal autonomy and self-determination. So no one wanted at any point for this to be something that someone might be coerced into, or a decision that anyone would be making on behalf of another person. And what they found was that ethically it was very tough to come to any kind of conclusion for a person who didn't have that capacity for themselves, and opened up things to abuses. The result of that has been that in the 20 years in Oregon, there's not been a single reported a case of coercion or abuse or anything like that. The law has been working really well, and that's why other states are now putting this policy in place. So this is not for a person who has lost capacity. This has to be a person who is able to make their own healthcare decisions. And so all of these criteria have to be confirmed not by one but two physicians. So in the process and in our law, there's an attending physician who actually writes the prescription, and then there's a consulting physician. And the consulting physician's job is to concur on all of those different pieces of eligibility, that this person is a resident of Oregon, that they're adult, that they have capacity to make their own healthcare decisions, that they have a prognosis of 6 months or less. They're not being coerced by anybody. This is an independent decision that they're making. 2 physicians have to agree on those pieces. And the process for them to get to writing a prescription is also a complicated one. And so I'll talk you through it. Again, you're not going to remember all these pieces. I forget them from time to time, and I talk about them every day. A person has to make multiple requests to their doctor. So you have to make one verbal request saying, I would like to pursue medical aid in dying with the Death with Dignity Act. You then wait 14 days, and you make a second request to that physician. So this was a built-in waiting period that the authors of the law put in place. It's been used in every law since, and it gives not only the physician a little bit of time to think through this, to get information from that consulting doctor, all of those different pieces, but also it was meant as a kind of waiting period for the patient to also think about this decision, to make sure that it's something that they want to pursue, and then to make a second request. The person also has to make a written request to their physician, and that written request is witnessed by 2 people. One of whom is someone who's not a blood relative and that doesn't stand to gain from that person's estate. And the second of whom is someone who does not own, operate, or work in a healthcare facility where that person resides. And the whole reason behind those criteria, again, is as a protection from coercion or abuse in any way, to make sure that we have some independent witnesses that are witnessing this written request. After a person has made the first oral request, the second oral request, has made their written request, has had a consulting physician agree with all of those different pieces, then that person can get a prescription for the medication. And what oftentimes happens is that a person goes through that process, they get the prescription for the medication, and they leave that prescription at the pharmacy. And if down the road they want to go pick it up, they can do that. They have the option to do so, but it's almost like an insurance policy or a sense of control just in having that waiting for them if they would want to go pick up that medication. This process also requires the physician to talk through all of the different end-of-life options that are available to the person. So that whole litany of things that we talked about before we got to our Death with Dignity Act in Oregon, a physician is required by law to talk through that when a person makes the request. And in fact, each of those different steps that I outlined, the oral requests, the prescription getting written, the written request, the consulting physician concurring with the other doctor, those are all documented on forms that are sent to the Oregon Health Authority and that are used to track all of the different numbers that go along with this. So it's quite a process, and on that form for the physician, he has to say, or she has to say, yes, we talked about all of these different options. We talked about hospice, we talked about palliative care, we talked about the option to stop eating and drinking, all of those different pieces. Yes? The question was, how is this then noted on the death certificate? And the law here in Oregon says that the death certificate should say that person's underlying illness. So on the death certificate, for example, if you had cancer and you went and got a prescription and you took that prescription, your death certificate would say cancer. Yeah. And so along with that, this has no effect on a person's life insurance, annuity benefits, anything like that. The law states specifically that it has no effect on those pieces. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, good question. So the question was, does a person have to be physically capable? And so a person has to be capable of self-administering the medication. Now what that means is that a person has to be able to take some action without which the medication would not be ingested. So for most people, that action is raising a glass to their lips and drinking the medication. The medication comes in a powder form, most often, and is mixed with about 4 ounces of water, and a person takes it that way. But self-administration also could be a person drinking from a straw, from a cup that's sitting on a table, because again, that's a process they could start and stop themselves. Oftentimes for folks who have ALS, as your late husband did, and as my grandmother did, they have the option to pour the medication into a feeding tube if they can do it that way. If they can't pour the medication, they have the option of depressing the plunger themselves on a feeding tube, because again, these are all affirmative actions that that person has to take in order for the medication to be ingested. And so those are all definitions that are given in the Oregon Health Law Manual that came out after the law was passed to say what exactly the law means by, our law in Oregon says that you have to ingest the medication yourself. And so they define what ingest means. And so those are all the different pieces of that. To talk a little bit more about this law and how it's played out, just so that you can have some context, and then we'll get to a lot of questions, I'm sure. In Oregon, since the beginning, there have been about 1,800 prescriptions that have been written here in the state. So over a course of 20 years. Comes out to about 0.4% of all deaths in Oregon that this is a part of. So a very small number of people. Of the people who have historically gotten prescriptions, every year the number is almost exactly that 2/3 of people who get a prescription end up taking that medication, and 1/3 end up not taking that medication. What we hear anecdotally is for that other third of people, they feel a great sense of relief and control in knowing that they have this option should their symptoms get to a point that they feel like this is necessary, should their quality of life diminish to the point where they feel like this is an option for them, but they get to that point, and they either die of the natural course of their disease or otherwise. So again, a full third of people end up not taking the prescription. Another interesting thing to note is, I talked about how during the process, a physician has to talk about all of the different options that are available to a person. And this goes back to our conversation about how do you know if you have a 6-month prognosis and how do you get all this information. And there was a study that was done in Oregon that found that for every one prescription that was written, 24 other people initiated the process with their doctor, so started the conversation about this option. And what they found in this study is that for that other 24 out of 25 people, that was the first time they had had an open, honest, transparent conversation about, one, the fact that their end of life was approaching, and two, what all of the different options were for them, and then all of those subjective pieces of what it was that they feared, what quality of life meant for them, how they could be able to stay in their own home, all of these different pieces that previously had not been discussed. And so the study went on to say that the law has been really responsible for a lot more open and transparent conversations across the state of Oregon about end-of-life care and about values-based care towards the end of life, because people use this as a way to open that door. And when a person brings it up, then that is an opportunity for that clinician to speak very openly and honestly and to know that this person is ready for those transparent conversations. So again, a reason for all of us, I think, to try to build that relationship of trust and to let people know that we're ready to receive that information. So before we jump into, I think, questions for the last little bit here, I think the thing that I always encourage people to do is, if you're interested in any of these different end-of-life options, to start a conversation with your care team about it, to start a conversation with your family and friends about it. We know from our experience here in Oregon that on average it takes a person about 6 weeks to get through the process of getting a prescription for medical aid in dying, because it requires a couple of physician visits. If any of you have tried to get an appointment with your doctor lately, it takes a little while. It might require some extra education for the person who's taking care of you. We provide that. We have a doc-to-doc line where doctors can call and get information. If this is the first time that they're going through this with a patient, they can talk to another doctor who's done this before. It might take some extended conversations with your family members to get them to a point of understanding all of your decisions and things as well. So if this is something that you're considering, we always encourage people to start early, to have these conversations early on with your doctor and with your family members and with your friends, so that when it gets to the point of urgency, you're not spending your last weeks or days or hours going to doctor visits. You're spending them with the peace of mind of knowing that you've secured this option for yourself, and then you can focus on living. Yeah, so the question was, can you put anything in writing in advance with your doctor saying, if I do lose my mental capacity and I get to this point of a diagnosis and all these, could I be given the medication then? And the answer is no. This law doesn't provide a space for that. Again, because in Oregon, when they drafted the law, they looked at similar laws across the world and different places, and found that in places where even they have crafted the law in such a way as that, it never actually happened, because it was such an ethically fishy spot to determine who was making decisions, the person's current self or their past self, and all of those different pieces. And so while it's widely recognized that you can put documentation in place when it comes to declining treatment in the future, so wanting to make sure that you, for example, that you have a do not resuscitate or whatever those might be, or things that you would put on your POLST form, which I know you spoke about previously at a talk. Those are things that are historically recognized. However, for this option, it's an important component that the person have capacity both at the beginning and at the end of the process, so that it's totally their decision. Great question. So the question was around, healthcare systems, and in Oregon, our law allows for healthcare systems to opt out of participation, meaning they have the option to prohibit their physicians from participating in this option. So they can say, our doctors are either not allowed to be that consulting physician or not allowed to be that prescribing physician in the process. And so the question was, what should you do with that information, and who are these large systems? And so in Oregon, a large percentage of our healthcare across the state is done by religiously affiliated systems, primarily Catholic healthcare, Providence, Peace Health, these larger systems. And because of that, those systems are required to operate under what are called the ethical religious directives, and they are the ERDs. And the ERDs say that physicians are not allowed to participate in this, so not allowed to write a prescription or to be that consulting physician. So what that means is if you are receiving your care through one of those healthcare systems and you want to pursue this option, you have to reestablish care elsewhere, outside of that system. So again, another piece to keep in mind as you're formulating your healthcare team that's around you, and another conversation to have, is, are you allowed to participate in this should I get to that point? And there are many people who then subsequently decide, to switch maybe who their Medicare provider is so that they can go to a different system, or who get a specialist that's outside of that system, whatever it might be, to make sure that they have this option down the road. But another reason to start this conversation early, because if you start when you get that 6-month prognosis, you have time to reshuffle a little bit and to reestablish care with somebody. Some of the most heartbreaking calls that we get are from folks who say, I just went to my doctor, he or she said that they would do this, but they're not allowed to, and now I need to go find a new doctor. We say, okay, well, what if they told you your prognosis is? Well, I think we're down to 3 weeks. And there's nothing that that person can do in that instance. It's just not feasible. It's just not possible. And so it's important to go through this early. Question in the back first. Great question. You got me to my final imploring of everybody before I didn't even have to bring it up myself, which is great. So so this option is one that we've had here in Oregon for 20 years. And I get a lot of questions about what's happening in current political climates and what might be the result for us. And so there are two things that are going on right now on a federal level. That if this is a topic that you're passionate about, I would encourage you to take some sort of action around. One is that our new nomination for the Supreme Court, Judge Gorsuch, is not only someone who is against the option of medical aid in dying, he literally wrote the book against it. Meaning he wrote the textbook against it in 2008. And so we can be fairly confident that if ever there were a legal challenge to our law here in Oregon and it made it to the Supreme Court, that he would not be someone who would fall on the line of support for this option. Along those lines, as I talked about, the District of Columbia passed at their city council their own law that authorizes this. And out of that, every law that's in the District of Columbia has to go to Congress, and normally it's a kind of a formality that they rubber stamp the law and say it's good to go and send it on. However, as was expressed, at this point we have 6 places where this is authorized. There's over 20 places where it's being considered this legislative season. And the head of the Oversight Committee in Washington, D.C., who's Jason Chaffetz out of Utah, decided that he would try to block that law in D.C. And in fact, this last week, the Oversight Committee voted in favor of a resolution that would block the law for the District of Columbia. That will then go to the House for a vote. And out of those conversations began this great interest in possibly pursuing a federal ban on the practice, which would mean that our law in Oregon was negated, the law in California, Washington, Vermont, all of us would cease to have access to this. Now you better believe that if that happens, organizations like ours would take legal action immediately, but as I said, the guy who could be sitting in the Supreme Court and be the tie-breaking vote is not somebody who is in favor of this option. So what that means is that it's time for all of us in Oregon who care about this cause to become active around it. And so if you're like me, you might have been really active already over the last couple of weeks with calling your legislators about different things and making your thoughts be known. But this is another thing to add to your list. And if it's something that does resonate with you, I encourage you to go to our website at compassioninchoices.org, grab the brochure, it's got that info on there. We make it really easy to take action on these things. You just have to fill out a form. It tells you who to call, or it'll give you the option to send an email immediately to that representative and let them know that this is something that you care about. But we are absolutely gearing up for a fight. What we believe may be kind of the fight for our lives when it comes to this movement and laws like this. And again, I would get a slap on the wrist by our fundraisers if I didn't say that we're a nonprofit and that we function on the donations of really wonderful and generous people. And as we approach that time, it's going to be quite a battle. So if this is something that moves you, I would also encourage you to make a gift on that bet.
Yeah.
Interesting question. Yeah. So let me talk about two points on that. One, you were talking about the fact that for some people at the end of life, they face some intractable suffering and are put on a lot of medications to, in some cases to decrease consciousness and to put them in, as you said, a twilight state or whatever it might be. When that happens to the nth degree, the option that exists for people and what existed before our law in Oregon was the option of palliative sedation. Something that happens less frequently now because our medications have gotten better that we use at the end of life, but it's the option for a person's healthcare team to induce a coma for that person, and then you wait. You wait for either the person's disease process to run its natural course and the person to die of that, or you wait for their body to dehydrate to the point where they pass. And that was a big motivation behind why the law came into effect in Oregon, is that there were people who were facing that decision and said, why can't I do this somewhat on my own terms, rather than having to say that there's going to be a team of people who put me unconscious and everybody waits for several days or whatever it might be. Now, the other thing that you alluded to is the fact that, for some people it might just take an extra tip of the hand with the morphine or whatever it might be for the person to die. Again, that's something that is increasingly not the case. So for one, we see people who are facing diseases like cancer that were once, death sentences right from the beginning, having multiple reoccurrences, so that by the time that they actually get to the end stage of that disease, their tolerance to opioids is absolutely phenomenal. People who are taking doses on the hour that for any one of us would be absolutely fatal. And so they have to utilize other options. And that's where we see a lot of people who use death with dignity making that decision when they get to the point where their pain is unmanageable while they're in a conscious state. And for them, they don't want to be placed in an unconscious state. The other thing that I'll say is you alluded to this sense of, again, the kind of extra tip of the hand or the wink and a nod, this is to treat pain or whatever it might be, which again was a practice that was happening more often before our law went into effect in Oregon, with a whole lot less transparency and a whole lot less regulation. And so what we hear a lot in other states who are working towards having these laws is that is an unregulated practice, one that for a person who participates, they could face some type of criminal charge, they could be accused of different things, whatever it might be, if they were intentionally going about trying to hasten a person's death. So what having a law does is it brings it out into the open, it makes it a transparent process where everybody can talk about this. Yeah, so, and to address that, the ethical background on that is what's called the double effect, which is why this is taken into account in medicine and why that happens, which is that a person is intentionally trying to treat a person's symptoms, and if the result is that a person's death comes sooner than not, the motivation is treating symptoms, is symptom management. So they call it the double effect, meaning a person is not intending to hasten someone's death, they're intending to treat symptoms, and the result might be that person's dying process is abbreviated. But again, for people who are making the decision to pursue medical aid in dying, it's important to them that decision is in their hands, and the intention is to abbreviate a dying process. It's not an unintended effect of treating symptoms or pain. So there's a little bit of a different ethical grounding in those two different pieces. Back here. So the question was around the right to refuse food and beverage, whether that's under assault. And I would say no, not that we've seen. Yeah. And again, that's kind of falls into the long-held tradition on both sides of the aisle of a person being able to make healthcare decisions. So taking in food or fluids is essentially a decision about the care for your own body, and you can do that. Yeah, great question. The question is, how expensive are the drugs? And maybe we'll wrap up with this one, because I think this is the end of my time. Or one more in the back, and then we'll be done. Just because she smiled. And so the medication that is used for this is quite expensive. The one that's used most often is Seconal, which you may be familiar with. It used to be a very familiar drug used for sleep and anxiety and several different things. However, this is now the only option that's being used for. It's been replaced otherwise in the market. A few years ago, the drug cost a couple $100. It has since been bought out by a pharmaceutical giant named Valiant, who you might be familiar with, and it costs a little over $4,000 for the medication. There are other options that exist. There are other options that exist that are less expensive, where there's been less experience with. Historically, Seconal has been the one that's been used the most, and so I suspect there will be more and more of those alternatives that pharmacists and doctors develop to try to combat that high cost. But at this point, the most often used one is quite expensive. If that flames you up like it does me, you can go on your computer and look up Valiant Congressional Hearing and watch Al Franken just yell at the CEO for about 15 minutes. And that'll satisfy your rage for at least a couple of days. All right, last question in the back. It's a good question. So the question was percentage of doctors who would do this. And so We know that nationally about 60% of doctors support this option. I guess in Oregon it's a bit more, but there hasn't been polling here for a long time. What I can tell you is that in Oregon last year there were a little over 200 prescriptions written, and those were written by 108 different doctors. So it is something that kind of saturates across the state, and it's not that like there's 10 physicians who do this and write all the different prescriptions. Most often, the doctor who writes a prescription is a person's primary care provider. Family physicians have done this more than any other group of physicians in the state. In studies, they've kind of qualitatively said that it's because a person has the longest relationship with that doctor and perhaps has the most trust and communication with that person because they've been caring for them for a long time. And then behind that are the specialists who are often caring for people with these type of illnesses. In Oregon, a little over 70% of the people who use the law have cancer, so oncologists are obviously very well involved with this. And then that other 30% is split pretty much between people who have neurological disorders like ALS and people who have some type of pulmonary condition such as COPD. And so oftentimes you'll see the person's primary care provider writing the prescription and their specialist being that consulting opinion on it. Something else that I'll add really quickly as I finish is that again, this is something, as you heard, 108 doctors last year. This is something that a physician may do once, twice in their career, may encounter it. So oftentimes we have to be really patient because this is a new process that takes some exploration. And so that's why we offer what we call our doc-to-doc line for physicians that are encountering this. The physicians that staff it are retired family doctors from here in Oregon who have done this for their patients before, who can talk through not only all the different clinical pieces, but also the other pieces like how'd you sleep afterwards? Did anybody throw a rock in your window? I mean, all the different things that come up for a person who is facing this really serious decision as a clinician for the first time. And so we always try to provide space and education for those doctors so that they can feel supported as they might be going through this process and supporting their patient through the same thing. Last thing I'll say is, again, a plug for our website and our resources, and a big thank you to everybody here on the organizing committee for having me out again, and for all of you for your thoughtful questions and for the opportunity to be with you instead of lobbyists. It was much more pleasant, and I'll be singing side by side in the car the whole way home. So, thank you.